Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 7th episode of We Got Planning News for You. I had to think there for a moment as to which number it was because we've done so many now. My name's Charlie Banner. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us again. We've got another packed show for you today, and it's great to see so many of you here once again. As always, please do continue to provide questions or comments in the Q&A function. Someone's already asked, is the chat function enabled? I think it is, but it's easier to do comments and questions in the Q&A function. As always, we'll try and deal with as many of those as possible, probably skipping over references to some of our music tastes. Somebody asked, they were praying that I would come on so the music might stop. There's an awful lot of irony you probably aren't aware of in that comment. As you know, this is a free show, but can I reiterate our usual encouragement to you to make a donation to the NHS COVID-19 Appeals Just Giving page, Clap for Our Carers, or alternatively a charity of your choice. And now it's time to introduce the panel. So can I ask each of the regular panelists to say in turn who you are, where you are, and what you're drinking this evening?
Good evening, it's Mary here from Wandsworth, but as you can see via Cornwall. And tonight, in honour of our very special guest, I'm A, flying the flag, and B, I'm drinking Tarquin's Cornish gin. Cheers.
Cheers.
Very good, Mary. Very good. Well, I'm Chris Young, and I am in Hogwarts as usual. I am drinking what is genuinely my favourite beer, which is Proper Job, which also describes how I'm feeling since I've now got some inquiries again. I feel like I've got a proper job. And I too have Cornwall all in the room. I don't know if you can see, but the owl is on a surfboard behind me over here. And there are my sea charts for the Isles of Scilly. So fully Cornish here.
And I'm Paul Tucker. I have absolutely no links to Cornwall, and therefore I'm going to change this to a proper flag and tell you that I'm a Yorkshireman, proud of it, but I happen to live in Lancashire. Hello, everybody. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I'm drinking something called Boondoogle, which is as near to Cornish beer as I can get. It's from Hampshire. As far as I'm concerned, it's southern, so it's all the same to me.
And I am Sasha White. I am in London. I am about 6 doors down from Charlie and we promised not to run down the corridor and disturb each other during the webinar. We did want Paul Tucker to do a Cornish accent, but we thought it might rival Dick Van Dyke in Chitty Bang Bang. So we resisted that. And I want to pay tribute to my Cornish roots because of our guest and my lovely St Agnes mother, born and bred in mighty Cornwall.
Thanks, Sasha. And indeed, Sasha and I are this week only a few metres, but more than 2 metres away from each other. We can't be in the same room, but I could chuck my Spurs hat, which I still have at him at a suitable moment, and see if I can get it to land on his head.
Yeah, it'd come back 4 times faster, Charlie, I assure you. Boomerang.
Yes, with a brick inside, probably too. What's been happening this week? Well, first and foremost, happy anniversary to Paul and Ursula, 27 years. Congratulations to the two of you. Chris has been busy this week, and it's very pleasing to see that he, like many barristers, Pat was going to show image of Chris on a site visit, but once again Sasha has perhaps advisedly disabled screen sharing. But Chris has been out on a site visit, and hopefully we'll get a picture of him on a suitably socially separated site visit soon, looking a little bit like an album cover, and wearing Speedos, but thankfully not budgie smoke.
And I'm wearing my Speedos right now.
We don't need to see them, Chris.
Stay seated, Chris, please.
We also have an extremely
They're
special
shorts, Paul. They're shorts.
We'll believe you. We have an extremely special guest today in the form of Lord Matthew Taylor. Matthew, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Matthew is, as everyone will know, the author of numerous reports into the planning system, a long-term champion of garden communities, which is going to be one of our special topics today, and part of the team led the original NPPF and PPG. As usual, our guest interview with Matthew is in the second half of the show, but before we get to that, Matthew, I'm sure you'll have quite a lot to say about our PINS decision of the week, Inspector Clue's findings in relation to the North Essex Authority's Local Plan Part 1, which proposed 3 garden communities, 2 of which he found unsound, and also on our special topic regarding garden communities. So without further ado...
wait, Charlie, but there is further ado, I'm afraid, and you've been very modest. We've got to admit to everyone that you've had a significant milestone this week, and actually you're now joined some of us in the post-40 camp. So I wanted to wish you happy birthday.
Cheers, thank you. Well, given that
Cheers,
today,
Charlie.
Cheers.
is the afternoon after the night before my birthday, I'm drinking ghost shit because that's how I feel. That's how I was feeling this morning. Anyway, without further ado, now our first topic this week is court case of the week. And we've chosen Client Earth's Judicial Review Challenge of the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to grant a DCO for effectively an extension to the Drax Power Station near Selby, North Yorkshire, for 2 gas-fired generating units, presumably to keep Paul's friends and family warm in the middle of the winter, given its location. And I'm just going to kick off with this. Judgment was given a few days ago by Mr. Justice Holgate, who rejected the Judicial Review Challenge on all 9 grounds. And there's a number of interesting features. The first of which is that the case was wholly digital. So it was a 3-day remote hearing, followed by a remote hand-down of judgment. Probably the most complex planning case to follow this fully remote procedure to date. There were 9 grounds of claim, a 54-page judgment. That's how thick it is, 262 paragraphs, a classic Mr. Justice Holgate tour de force in a case of considerable public interest and importance, and illustrative of the fact that during this COVID crisis, it can be done this way. The context is that the PINS examining panel recommended refusal of the application. The Secretary of State disagreed. The main issue concerned the interpretation of the overarching national policy statement on energy and the NPS for fossil fuel infrastructure. The inspectors held that whilst the NPS has supported a need in general for additional energy infrastructure, Drax hadn't demonstrated that their particular development itself met an identified need. And the Secretary of State didn't agree with that approach. The Secretary of State's view was that the NPS has assumed a general need for fossil fuel generation, and that general need meant that it wasn't necessary for a particular applicant to propose a specific project need for their scheme. In other words, the NPS meant that need was taken as read and didn't need to be proved. Mr. Justice Holgate held, firstly, this was a question of interpretation of the policy. So unlike some cases where it's possible to hide behind planning judgment and say this is all a matter of Wednesbury reasonableness, this was a case where the judge felt it was a valid issue to be considered by the court. But having considered it, he thought the Secretary of State got it bang on, correct. In his view, the NPS assumed need, left it to the market to deliver that need for this kind of infrastructure without the need having to be assessed quantitatively for any individual application. And he went on to say that the panel's comment that needs should be reassessed from time to time following the NPS, he felt that was illegitimate, as it's a matter for the government to review the NPS to see whether the identification of need was up to date, rather than for individual decisions to effectively review the NPS by the back door. So until such time as the NPS is reviewed, need is taken as a given. And he went on to held also, on a separate but related point, that that the NPSs were to be read as providing that greenhouse gas emissions from this kind of project weren't a reason for refusing a DCO. He read the NPS as providing that that was a matter for other regimes, and he thought that was perfectly legally fine for an NPS to take that approach. So in terms of my observations on this, first, it's a pretty significant judgment in the context of nationally significant energy infrastructure projects, of which there are many. It highlights more generally, both in relation to this kind of project and all NSIPs, the fundamental role that NPSs play in the determination of DCO decisions, and how by the time of the DCO stage, some, if not many, of the key arguments have already been dealt with. So those objecting to a national significant infrastructure project need to be alive to the fact that they may well need to look at and engage with the process leading to the NPS, because by that stage the past may be sold on really important arguments. And it's perhaps no surprise, therefore, there's been a recent flurry in challenges to the NPS, as the airports one, got that one in again before Paul asked who was in that case, the airports NPS, the current judicial reviews, the failure to review the energy NPSs, and I think it's likely that we're going to see a greater focus on that earlier stage. Also, it's notable for Mr. Justice Holgate rejecting the proposition that there's a heightened duty to give reasons when the Secretary of State disagrees with an inspector. So those are my thoughts. Sasha, you've got some observations on this one too, haven't you?
I do, Charlie. Before I give them, I just want to talk about our esteemed colleague Craig Jones's 9 grounds, because one of our panellists appeared against me, Mr. Paul Tucker QC. We appeared together in the Court of Appeal. And I can see the smile appearing because he'll remember this story. Mr. Tucker had 13 grounds, and he started off about to speak, as we all do, with our extensive notes, and the very esteemed bench of Lord Justice Carnworth and Lord Justice Sullivan said, Lord Justice Carnworth looked at Paul as he sat down and said, Mr. Tucker, we've looked at your grounds, and Lord Justice Sullivan and I have come to the view that probably we want to hear from you on your ground number 1 alone. And Paul, one of the great recoveries in modern advocacy, held his nerve, kept going against that very clear steer from such a powerful bench. So I just, on Paul's anniversary, I can see what Ursula sees in you: cool under pressure, resilient, and kept on going in the face of an almighty battle. So congratulations to you.
Yeah, and still lost, Sasha.
Well, that case I always remark, because it's about the only time that one of the leading proponents of the grounds was Lanky, the Lancashire cricket mascot, who'd barred Paul's clients from entering the relevant committee meeting. Ground 1, a large furry animal barred the claimant from appearing and entering the committee. One of the most unique grounds in legal history. But what I want to say about this, I mean, I do think in the micro you've summarised very well. In the macro, it does raise the question of how difficult it is to challenge DCOs, because this has been looked at, and I think roughly 70 DCOs have been granted in their lifetime since they became part of a mechanism for granting consents of this nature. 10 have been challenged, and all but 1 has succeeded. So think about that. The courts have intervened in 1 of 70. So it just shows really it's incredibly difficult to challenge in law the mechanism of DCO, and it begs the question, frankly, from the proponents of them, why they're not used more widely in view of that level of success. So I just wanted to flag up, and I also thought, and I do want to say to Mr. Justice Holgate, this is an exemplar of a decision and a judgment. If anyone doubts the intellectual rigour of the High Court, they need to read this decision. Greg might not agree with me, but I would certainly, sure, Andrew Tate and James Strawn would. But that's my comment about it, the DCO.
Thanks, Sasha. And we might come back to that issue about the wider use of the DCO process when we come to talk about garden communities in a few moments' time. But before we do that, we've got the key PINS decision of the week, which, on the theme of garden communities, relates to the North Essex Authority's shared local plan. And Chris, you're going to introduce this item.
Yes, I am. And it's the North Essex Authority's Shared Strategic Section 1 plan, which I can tell you is not easy to say after 3 proper jobs. Okay. The 3 authorities concerned are Braintree District Council, Colchester Borough Council and Tendring District Council, all in Essex. They proposed 3 plans, but with an identical Section 1, which was the strategic part. And the eye-catching part of these plans is they proposed 3 new settlements as garden communities, with the ambition of delivering, wait for it, up to 43,000 new homes. Now, each one of these was a cross-boundary proposal. If you look at the authorities across North Essex, you've got Tendring on the east, then Colchester in the middle, then Braintree, and next to them is Uttlesford, which also feature in this story, and who've recently abandoned their own plan earlier this year. The new settlements were located on the boundary of the 3 authorities. We have the Tendring Colchester border garden community, which made it through. The Colchester Braintree borders one that didn't, and the west of Braintree garden community that didn't. They're all backed by the government, having been selected through the garden communities competition. The inspector was Roger Clues, who is a very experienced local plan inspector, and in my view, the man with the second best hair in planning right now.
Chris, surely.
He was, I've appeared before him promoting a plan for 3 authorities, myself in South Worcestershire. He didn't accept the housing numbers first of all until they got a more realistic figure. And also in the Birmingham plan, he did allow that plan through, but he said they had to deal with the 38,000 shortfall within 3 years, or it was coming home to Birmingham. So vastly experienced, a very robust inspector who understands the system like the back of his hand. The examination process had already been going on for a long time, and he produced his report, 58 pages long. he questioned the deliverability of these garden villages, which raises a fundamental issue about the whole project, and we're going to come on to with Matthew. He wrote to the council in June 2018, setting out his concerns then. He allowed the council to suspend the examination process until January of this year, therefore giving them plenty of time to improve their evidence, and they were obviously greatly assisted by the developers. But he found on the evidence that he wasn't satisfied with 2 of the 3 garden villages. He found the tendering Colchester border one sound, but he's asked that the other 2 be removed, otherwise he'll find the Section 1 plan unsound. The main issue, briefly, is financial viability. The plans were examined under NPPF1, the 2012 version, and paragraph 173 of that, everybody knows, requires landowners to receive a competitive return for the land. And the problem is it's devilishly difficult to know what the appropriate land value should be. I know Matthew's got views about how we should approach that issue. But from paragraph 201 in his huge report, he sets out that generally participants had clustered around the idea of a price of around £100,000 per acre being the minimum for a competitive return to the landowner. And although the evidence was limited on that, that seemed to be indicative of current market conditions. He felt that would be sufficient for landowners within the garden community to sell, because obviously not all of them had been signed up. But whilst he wasn't entirely clear what the correct figure would be, he felt a land price below £50,000 an acre, half that figure, appears unlikely to be sufficient. So that was the threshold in effect that he set. And on that basis, without going through all the detail, he found that only one of them could achieve that, because it required a 40% contingency into the exercise because of the stage we're at and the uncertainty and the infrastructure. So that 40% contingency, if that becomes widely adopted, that's a huge inflation on the costs associated with these proposals. Yet the one that got through was able to achieve that. There's been lots of reaction to this. The councils are obviously disappointed. I'm trying to keep within a time slot, but it's quite clear that the viability was absolutely central to this issue. And people, including the council leaders, are questioning whether the plan proposal can really address this, because not a great deal of the housing required for the plan period was actually in these communities. They're much more ambitious, much more long term, but just on that basis, he's found 2 of them unsound.
Mary, what do you think?
I want to focus on the sustainability appraisal process, because in his earlier June 2018 letter, he had given the councils a clear steer as to what he thought was the inadequacies of their approach to the sustainability appraisal. And he questioned in particular the objectivity of the work that Essex County Council had done. And so independent external consultants were deployed, and they looked at alternative strategic sites that could form part of the plan's spatial strategy. And they also looked at alternative spatial strategies. But the exercise that they had to do was really limited in the sense that this was not a joint local plan between 3 authorities looking at what should happen across the whole of the spatial area of these 3. So the exercise was more confined because it was really focusing simply on these 3 garden communities. And he found that in looking at reasonable alternatives, it was okay simply to focus on sites that could deliver 2,000 or more. He ultimately gave the sustainability appraisal a green light. The other thing I just want to draw out is that it seemed to me he took a quite different approach to the inspectors in Uttlesford on the question of whether the sustainability was appropriate in the way it dealt with heritage. In the case of the 3 Essex authorities, they took a proximity-based approach to considering the effect of the potential communities on designated heritage assets. So they simply said, is there 5% or more of each site lying within a 500-metre distance of a designated heritage asset? And the answer, in fact, in each case was yes. And so they said, well, there would be a significant negative effect with uncertainty. Historic England said, no, you need to do an historic impact assessment to inform your SA. And the inspector basically said, no, I don't think you do, because all this plan is doing is identifying 3 very broad locations. And it will be for separate development plan documents to come along and identify precisely where in those broad locations the garden communities should actually be. And so therefore, this very limited proximity-based approach he thought was right. Whereas in Uttlesford, you will recall, one of the reasons the 3 garden villages promoted by one authority went down was because there they had done more work. They had actually done a heritage impact assessment of each of their garden communities, although it was done independently and after the sustainability appraisal. And they still got kicked by the inspectors because it was said that the HIA demonstrated that there would be negative effects on designated historic assets. So quite honestly, I sort of stand back and think, well, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to do the HIA or are you not? Because in both cases, the councils were just simply identifying broad locations, anticipating a subsequent development plan document. And yet the inspectors have approached it quite differently. I think that inconsistency is not helpful for any of us.
It'll be interesting how that's resolved going forward. Thanks for that, Mary. Next up, we've got our special topic for this week, garden communities, because this isn't by any means the first unsuccessful garden community local plan that we discussed on this show. So we thought we'd address the issue of why are so many failing at the local plan stage and what can be done about it? What's the solution? And Paul, you're going to kick off this topic.
Yeah, I'm just going to say a few things, then hand over to Mary, who's going to ask Matthew 1 or 2 difficult questions. We've talked about unsuccessful garden communities. Can I just remind everybody who's watching the show that we have a history of 120 years of very successful garden communities. We have extraordinary ones like Saltaire and Port Sunlight, not a million miles away from me. We have Stevenage, Milton Keynes, and then as I look out my window, I see the remnants of the Central Lancs Newtown, also known as Preston Chorley and South Ribble, as well as the delights of Skelmersdale. And I do mean delights of Skelmersdale. I pass it and wave as I drive to other parts of the northwest. But there have been immensely successful garden communities over the last century or so that have delivered and have created viable, sustainable communities. But those, by and large, have been in the context of a very different development plan system, have been at a time when we built council estates, at a time when infrastructure wasn't primarily reliant upon the private sector, and at a time when we had regional planning. So we've not only got the most favourable context for the promotion of garden communities at the moment, but I suspect we have the most unfavourable, sorry, the most favourable policy context, but the most unfavourable practical context for the promotion of garden communities. And yet there is a headroom in terms of the private sector and government to promote them. So there are a series of issues which arise in terms of how we do it now and whether or not our current system is fit for purpose. Should we abandon the whole idea following things such as North Essex? Should we recognise there's a need for the state to fund and pump prime them? Should we build council houses again? Should we bring in new town corporations once again? Should we change the soundness test of NPPF? Could the surviving Essex garden community provide the answer? But most fundamentally, should we be reviewing our development plan, our regional planning system, or our non-regional planning system in order to be able to promote these? And I'm looking forward to hearing Mary ask those questions and elicit the answers from Matthew.
Thanks for that.
Over to you, Matthew.
I mean, my own kind of, I can't help but wonder from my own perspective of some of these cases is that the more ambitious and potentially beneficial a proposal, and this applies to garden communities and other things too, the greater the risk there often is in the risk that they may not succeed. The greater the risk, the greater reward. And is the policy and decision-making framework currently available capable of accommodating that level of risk? Maybe that's something that Mary and Matthew, you'll address. Over to you, Mary, to start the interview with Matthew.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Matthew. I've got 6 questions I would like to ask you before I hand you over to the others. The first question I'd like to ask you is this. Is the government's plan-led system fit for promoting whole new garden communities as opposed to sort of incremental expansions?
I think what we have to start with is remembering what the Garden Communities Programme was fundamentally about, which was that the planning system as is had proved itself unfit to deliver the number of homes that we needed. So we had seen over a very long period of time insufficient homes. And my view was that over the years, what had happened was an original system that had 3 legs to the stool: urban renewal, urban extension, and new settlements, had the new settlement leg taken away from it, and that without that, the concentration on redevelopment and urban extension had actually put enormous pressure politically, because people were revolting against what was happening at the end of their garden, frankly. And because people could identify the next sequential site, land values for those urban extensions had made it impossible to deliver quality, bluntly. So the solution, just to add that leg back in and allow communities to choose new settlements if that's what they preferred, was the solution. It's been a very popular one. We've seen huge numbers being brought forward. We've seen local authorities reacting in a way that I hoped they would, and the government hoped they would, and many of these obviously in the Garden Village and Town programme, and many more in process. Then the question is, well, we attempted to unlock this opportunity. It's clearly been seized by the people who represent people, and now we're seeing it blocked, if you like, by the system, by the examination, by the inspectorate. 2 questions there. One is, have we got a problem? And I think this is true in the local authorities, perhaps with the inspectorate as well. We've got a generation of people brought up to be highly sceptical about new settlements because they were told they were a bad idea and unsustainable. But also, is the examination system really designed for very large scale schemes that will take many, many years to deliver? And I think the conclusion, if we take Richard Drew's examination, at least, would be no, because I think the bars have been set here at hurdle rates that would be impossible for frankly any major scheme to get through.
Well, that sort of leads on to my second question, because I mean, is it realistic to think that planning authorities have access to the skill set and the resources that are required to plan a new garden community? Is that really the issue, or is the issue really the difficulty of having to prove the viability of such schemes at a local plan examination, particularly if they have to rely upon public funds and infrastructure? Is it?
I think there are bound to be skill shortages, of course, and we've not got a generation of planners who've done this. There's very few that have created new settlements, and I spend a lot of time going around local authorities as well as working with promoters and landowners to help them through that thinking process. And I have to say, one shouldn't be overly pessimistic. We're getting garden communities through, as well as we're getting some blocked and getting into difficulties. So it's not that it can never happen. But when I go in, I talk about these being promoted as a partnership between the long-term interest on the private sector side. That could be the landowners, it can be an investor in place, it can be a placemaker, working in partnership with the local authority. So if you take the Carclays Garden Village, originally an eco-town down outside St Austell, I chair the strategic partnership that puts together Homes England, the local authority and the private sector in the same room. And I don't believe they work in any other form. I'm always sceptical of schemes that come forward with multiple landowners who haven't got any agreement, where they're reliant on selling up parcels of land, and people have really not got into their heads that this is an opportunity for people holding land at agricultural value to make greatly increased value in place. But it's much more likely to happen as a long-term project where you've got either a single landowner or it's become effectively a single landowner working in partnership with the local authority. And then finally, not predicating it on massive infrastructure investment. I think all of those that have been predicated on huge infrastructure investment have found it difficult. Mm-hmm. So why are you doing that? That's not what the Garden Village programme said. That's not what the scheme that I put forward. There will be circumstances where that should happen. But if that's going to happen, I think the government need to step up to the mark in whether it's using the New Towns Act, making upfront promises or investment, or changing the planning system and saying that these very long-term schemes are about taking a decision in principle to do something, and we will test it on your delivery. But of course, you can't expect that far in advance to test it on viability when it will depend on government funding decisions, for example, that are yet to be taken.
So would you agree, therefore, that the viability of garden communities needs to be approached in a different way to the viability of other sites?
Depends on the community. So I'm working with many schemes where they've understood what the garden village community principles are, that you're creating an internalisation of place, that it's a long-term investment play, that you need to be very clear about your delivery structure, and by and large, they need to be consuming their own smoke in terms of not just the impacts on the surrounding community, but actually their ability to fund themselves. And many of them have understood that, and then work in partnership with the council to deliver it. But beyond that, yeah, no, we need to make certain, if we're going to do what North Essex has attempted to do, you need to go beyond it. And we know that. In fact, the inspector referred it to in his report. There was talk of using the New Towns Act here. Government, I understand, was up to using the New Towns Act. Well, that immediately raises some questions about, were we getting this back to front? Should it be much clearer right from the word go how this was going to be taken forward? But having said all of that, I think they had the right intentions. They took a very big call on the long-term view. They were willing as elected members to take on a very, very active campaign against. And I think they'll be devastated by this because certainly one of them, actually, Richard earlier in his report says that 50,000 an acre is viable. Well, I'm working on schemes that are looking at that sort of number, because otherwise the land is not developable. It's agricultural land. This is not edge of town where you hold on for later money. So in his own report, I think he set a bar with the 40% contingency with the land values and so on that make it very difficult to deliver any major scheme, not just garden villages and towns. I think this throws in doubt anything other than the small-scale sequential development of place, which is the very thing that policy has been trying to move us away from.
Well, what more can landowners and promoters do you think, at this stage in order to demonstrate delivery?
So take us back to Uttlesford. And for those who read that review, one of the things that was remarkable was that you had a scheme that was being promoted with local authority support, but where there were multiple landowners, and at examination, the landowners who had secured a local authority supporting a new settlement there then fell out with the local authority about the delivery structure. And the delivery structure, of course, was all about guaranteeing the quality of place and meeting the garden village settlement. Well, they didn't do very well out of that. But the first thing, when I talk, and I do a lot of work with landowners and promoters, the first thing I say to them is, you need to understand this is not an urban extension on land that would otherwise be developed. It is all about a placemaking piece. It's a long-term investment in place. So you've got to accept that that has implications for land value. If you like, the things that you're going to need to put in place, the road, the transport infrastructure, the community, the mixed community, the school, all of that is the price of the permission to build thousands of homes somewhere that otherwise there would never be development. And that has to reset the land values. And that's part of the answer to Richard Drew. You can't take a normal land value position, but neither can the promoters, and they need to understand that, and need to, so the landowners, and perhaps most of all the land agents, need to be clear about that in the advice they're giving. Because I do see that going wrong. Yeah. And secondly, it has to be a full partnership with the local authority. But actually, ironically, North Essex may be very favourable to those landowners and promoters who are willing to do all of that. Because if you can offer, in effect, we accept these land values, we accept what needs to be done, here's our offer in placemaking and how we will do that, then I think local authorities will be able to meet the tests that are here. What's much more difficult, but then I've always advised against it, is a local authority deciding we're going to build it here without having got the commitments of the landowners, because as soon as they do that, and we've seen a number of local authorities doing this around the country, as soon as you publish something that says we're looking to this area, of course people will come in and take options out. Of course the landowners will be advised for much higher values than actually a garden community can generate. But in doing so, I think this makes very clear that those landowners need to think twice, because they will lose everything if they ask for too much.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to ask you one last question before I open this up. Are DCOs the answer to these failing examinations?
Okay, so far I've said, here's what the policy was intended to do, and we have got a problem with this conclusion and with these tests. I think that the issue here is probably not to go for DCOs. Certainly not. I think people are using it as a shorthand for reform, really, because I think it would be a nightmare decision to say, well, we're going to take this into national hands. If you started parceling out where these things are to go nationally, the decision was no longer a local promotion and supported by a local community, you'd run into the problem we've seen previously with new settlements in the last 20-odd years, the Ecotown programme, where it looked like it was being dictated centrally and it fell apart. You'd have all the problems of Heathrow, you'd have all the problems of HS2. So they have to be locally generated and through local leadership. But where that happens, my view is we should go back to the roots of local planning. But the local plan is the long-term vision of place. It's not about, have you got the very best solution? You've got your local choice on this. It's not about, can you detail exactly how this will be funded and how many homes this year? It will be, we want to grow in Cornwall, for example, with a set of new communities rather than surround every historic town and village with new estates. That's a fundamental decision that they should be allowed to take in a local plan, describe where that will be. Of course, they have to show how that will be delivered, but not at a level of this kind of test. This is a test for another time and another place. Where their feet should be held to the fire is on delivery, which is why some years ago I proposed the delivery test. The irony was we got the delivery test and kept the 5-year supply. Well, the 5-year supply was meant to go. It was meant to be, create your vision, show us what you're going to do, of course have short-term supply, but beyond that, this is about vision and placemaking. But we will then hold your feet to the fire on delivery. And I think that fundamental reform would make all the difference. We tried to push that in NPPF2. The words were there, particularly footnote 35. That was all trying to do that. The changes, read the changes between the two. But clearly we need to go further.
We do have to remember that the examinations we've been talking about were examined under NPPF 2012, the first version. Now, I've hogged you.
And if I may, Lord Ethics possibly should have gone back 2 steps to go forward on NPPF2.
I'm going to hand you over to Paul so he can ask his question. Paul.
Yeah, I'm going to ask my question. Before I do, just to prove that we're on a live show, and the question has just been asked by Dave Proudlove, which strikes me as being really compelling question, which is, all your points really lead to, shouldn't we really be reforming the 1961 Land Compensation Act, or rather the structure by which a developer can acquire land on a back-to-back agreement with the authority? Make life easy for them. Now, that's the first question. I'm going to do it like we do on the COVID briefings. I'm going to ask you 2, Matthew, if that's okay. My real question relates to the New Towns Act, which is, when I started off dealing with the remnants of the Central Lancs New Town and the Warrington New Town and the Section 9 consent and the arguments in relation to that. And the whole thing about the New Town Corporation was, it was all about delivery. The whole structure of the Act was about delivery once the corporation's being set up. Why on earth aren't we promoting Newtown Act style solutions to the promotion of garden communities? Why haven't those been at the forefront of our promotion of them thus far?
Well, how ironic that what the government thought might be the first new town is the one we're discussing today and has just not got there. So, or at least the first use of the New Towns Act. So when I wrote the Garden Village report, I talked about modernising the New Towns Act and using that. We should remember that, for example, in Milton Keynes, it wasn't that the land was acquired by CPO, with a couple of tiny exceptions. It was done by treaty, but it was done in the knowledge that the value was set by that ability to acquire land at existing use, not taking into account the Newtown proposal. And that allowed land to be acquired. It allowed the assembly of the site, and landowners came in with that through negotiation of the treaty and didn't do too badly out of that at all themselves. That New Towns Act modernisation I proposed to take place. I was able, working with government, to make amendments to the Act, so the opportunity is there in a way that it wasn't. And actually, some landowners and local authorities have understood that that threat, if you like, was there around values, and I think it's helped with some of the discussions about how things might happen. But we don't have a government that is inclined to that kind of state intervention, or at least we didn't pre-Boris, and he's been a little distracted recently, so we'll see what happens next. But they, even before that, a Conservative government passed those changes. So that is there as a potential tool, but it doesn't need to happen if you've got not just a willing landowner to sell at a right price, but if you've got landowners coming forward who are willing to really invest in place. That may be the original landowner, it may be a new one, an investor in place, but someone who will carry the land through. And I think that is a fundamental necessity to create the kind of places I'm talking about. So either a private sector investor in place, the original landowner or a new, who is willing to take a long-term return by creating pace and value through great placemaking, or local authorities need to acquire the land for it. I was challenged by a planner from Barcelona. I did a presentation to CPRE in Wessex, where they were very supportive of this, incidentally. CPRE have acknowledged in many places the value of taking this approach. And that planner said, I don't understand why you are, in your local plans, allocating places to create new communities without acquiring the land to do it. Why are you losing control at that point? You're taking this huge political decision to turn fields into a new place, not on the edge of town where it carries existing value, but in the middle of nowhere where you can create value only by virtue of government decision. Why wouldn't you acquire the land at that point? Just as why do Homes England dispose of places where they could curate, not directly developing, but by commissioning the curation of place? I like the DIO have sold in many places, but in some places they've retained the land ownership whilst creating place. And actually, I think that was a great thing for the MOD to have done, because it allows that creation and curation of place to take place without the land transfer happening early on, which right. Often makes it impossible to afford.
Thank you, Matthew. Sorry, I should have said the most important question is the one that it's really not for you, it's for the rest of my panelists, which is why 3 weeks ago when I came on and put my name as Chris Young, I received a torrent of abuse. And yet Mary sat there for 48 minutes with the name Chris Young rather than Mary Cook. And not a word has been said. What's going on, chaps? This is not fair.
I've got bits on me that you haven't got, that we're obvious. Now, talking of go to the real Chris Young, let's go to the real Chris Young for his question, please.
I am the real Chris Young. Okay. Now, first of all, I have to confess, Matthew, that I am a fully paid up member of the Matthew Taylor Appreciation Society. And the reason I am is because you produced this. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. That is brilliant. Alison Freeman from Emery Planning, lovely Alison, put me onto that during an inquiry in front of Christina Downs, and to try and promote something in a very small hamlet. Brilliant. I mean, that is the whole seedbed of the NPPF and sustainable development and looking positively at development. Okay, so my question is, with full appreciation, but can I nail you down, please, to what actually are the ingredients that make a new community, not just a garden community, a new community successful? Richard Schofield, the inspector in Harrogate, has just proved one that I've been involved in, and they are successful. Let's be absolutely clear, despite talking about North Essex. But what are the ingredients to succeed?
So I think I probably touched on a lot, but let me summarise. If people are coming to me and getting advice and saying, what do you think our chances are? First issue, the land ownership. That could be New Towns Act, but it could be the local authority owns land, it could be Homes England, it could be the NI, but it can be private sector too. But if you haven't got either a single landowner or the landowners in a form of consortium that genuinely is able to operate together and accepts that this is a long-term play and reflects the values of a garden community, not the values of 150 units on an acre or two at the edge of town, then you're going to fail. So who's holding this, and are they willing to hold it through the process? Number two, do they understand the GB values? And that's, of course, often I'm coming in and talking them through that. So they are going to have to, it is about investment in place. It is not the same as promoting a few acres on the edge of town. And the expectations of that are going to be about internalisation, a genuine 21st century market town, not a housing estate. And that affects the values that can be expected. So have they understood that? Thirdly, partner with the LPA. Actually, they're going to have to take it through the local plan. So if the local authority is not supporting this, there's no point in even starting. So given that, you've got to be in a strong partnership with the local authority. Otherwise, don't even start thinking about it. Fourthly, can you describe the management of the delivery? And actually, to be fair to Richard, please, that's, you know, I don't agree with him on his viability test, but nonetheless, he's trying to work through, are they capable of delivering this? And for many in the private sector, they are actually looking to parcel it up and sell it in blocks of 300. That is not how you're going to deliver a new community. You need to have a master developer, an investor in place. If you're not that yourselves, you need to find that partner. And I'm often putting together people who are willing to do that long-term investment. Often, actually, a lot of my work is with people who've already got track record of long-term placemaking, and that may be in partnership with, or indeed it's often actually a housing association who hold place for the very long term. And finally, to state the bleeding obvious, given we're talking about North Essex, don't choose somewhere where you're going to have the most enormous bill for infrastructure where you can't actually explain how you're going to pay it. And we do see some that have actually been passed that are then stalled because they can't actually come up with the cash. So you've got to be, really, this is about a different mindset. It's about being in a different place, but there's no question too. My original proposal was about garden villages. That was extended to garden towns. Government likes them big because fewer is easier actually for development. Up to 6,000, I can help you. 20,000, then you're going to have the questions that Richard's asking.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question and a reasonably short answer. Now I'm going to have to make the question shorter and the answers even shorter, please, gentlemen. Charlie, your question.
Thanks, Mary. Quick one, Matthew. Is there a role in your view for Parliament in the promotion of garden villages, and if so, what is it?
No, I want it to be locally led. If the question is, should Parliament be deciding where they go? Well, you do Heathrow, I'll do the locally led garden community. I know which of us will finish first.
Sasha, that takes us neatly to Sasha's question.
I'm not going to ask garden villages. I'm going to go off piste. Matthew, who do you want to be the next leader of your party?
Ooh.
Oh, well, actually, there's a straightforward answer, which is Ed Davey, because he and I have worked together for a very, very long time. I actually, he started work as a researcher, filling my old shoes as a researcher in the parliamentary party, because I'd been elected at 24 very unexpectedly when my then boss, well, my only ever boss, David Penhaligon, had been killed in a car crash just outside Truro a couple of days before Christmas, and I'd been working for him for 6 months with no intention whatsoever of being an MP. Guess how I got the job? I was an economic policy advisor. I had a horrendous interview with an economics professor who noticed I didn't, despite my PPE degree, I'd done political philosophy. I knew nothing about economics. So they noticed that David Penhaligon was interested in one thing only. How come you went to school in Truro, soon as he knew that I lived just outside Truro as a little boy, I had the job. There you go.
Well, thank you
I'm
very
supporting Ed Davey. He's not from Cornwall, shame to say, but I guess it's the nearest equivalent. Is so how did you get to be leader of the Liberal Democrats? Well, I used to work for Matthew Taylor 40 years ago.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much for your questions, fellow panelists, and thank you very much, Matthew, for all your answers and your time. Back to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Mary. Back to me only briefly, Mary, or should I say Chris? And over to Sasha now for Champion and Nudge of the Week, which we're going to do as a double header.
Thank you so much. I'm just trying to work out what's more unlikely, me wearing any Spurs clothing or appearing on this show as Chris Young. But I'm going to deal with, just quickly, Champion of the Week. And I think all of us agree that the Champion of the Week in the planning system has been Sefton Council, who have published a very productive and positive statement about how they're going to try and operate their planning service. And they've got a 7-point plan. And can I ask those of you who are watching from local authorities to have a look at it, because it's a very productive, positive manifesto. Free meetings for investors and developers, free pre-app advice, refund planning application fees for schemes that seek a renewal of consent, speedier decision-making, longer timeframes to commence development, flexible approach on temporary schemes, and flexible approach on enforcement. So what an extraordinarily positive statement. So I think they're my Champion of the Week, and authority have really tried to be as positive as possible. Now, Nudge of the Week, a bit more controversial. You can't not mention East Riding. I can't not mention West Ferry. And it was, again, the subject in parliamentary questions. I know Lord Adonis has mentioned this, or probably a colleague and known to Matthew. Lord Adonis has mentioned this. The Metropolitan Police have now got involved. But what I would say is, I would say Nudge of the Week to the Secretary of State. There's an allegation of alleged bias. It can end immediately with the release of the correspondence and emails that led to that decision. So I just say the Nudge of the Week to end the political flack that is currently being generated, and to restore confidence in the planning system and the head of the planning system. Let's have release of all the correspondence, and that would put the matter to bed one way or the other.
You're treating this like a judicial review proceedings, and you're just fishing for the documents.
I'm actually generally not. Well, you will know, Chris, if without releasing the documents, I'm looking at another 4 weeks in Tower Hamlets, which was delightful last August. So no, I'm not. For once, I'm not putting my personal requirement. I just think, seriously, as we all know, the Secretary of State, there are serious questions about what went on being raised by all the political parties, and that can be answered in one very easy way, by releasing the correspondence. That's all that's required, and the emails. If they're not released, that cloud of suspicion will, as long as the current incumbent is the Secretary of State, will always be there. It's as simple as that.
Thanks, Sasha. You mentioned East Riding, and I can't help but mention East Riding. I'm pleased to say, having moved house this week, as well as turning 40, the very first thing that went up on my wall was a picture of nowhere else but East Riding. And indeed, I'm speaking to some of my friends at the East Riding Council tomorrow, and look forward to showing that very picture. So such is my love of that wonderful part of the world, and indeed, Paul.
Please give them my love, Charlie.
I will have, and Chris. Sorry once again, Chris.
And when are we going to announce, Charlie, that we're all going to Matthew's house for supper after the lockdown, all paying a visit to Cornwall to reclaim our roots?
Well, when's the? You haven't been invited yet. I'm not sure you. but before I do invite, fill the audience out there. How many members of this panel might have a second home in Cornwall? There's a challenge question to you all. And once I've been invited to any second homes anyone might have, then obviously you get an invite here.
Well, I'll tell you, Matthew, that's
very welcome to come and see me in Harlem Bay when I'm allowed to go there.
Well, no time soon, but don't take it personally.
Because I lost the judicial review for St Ives, but there we are. Anyway, thank you all very much for joining us again, and particular thanks, of course, to Matthew for coming on facing our questions, and indeed really engaging with the whole show, and some really interesting insight and food for thought. Lots and lots of questions and comments, some of which we've dealt with in substance, some of which either we haven't had time to, one or two may yet be the subject of debate in one or other forum. Please do continue the debate if you'd like to on our LinkedIn page, which we encourage you to follow. Please don't forget the donations to the NHS or another charity of your choice if you're so minded. We'll see you next week, same time, same place. We're lining up another really interesting special guest. We'll get the details out to you early next week. Have a great weekend. Sorry that the sun's no longer shining, but enjoy your weekend ahead, and see you next week. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Cheers.